He drove into the northern mountains to escape the noise in his mind, not knowing the mountain was hiding a secret of its own. When his German shepherd suddenly froze on a silent trail, it wasn't fear. It was a warning. Buried beneath an old cabin lay a forgotten Cold War project, and a fault line no one wanted to admit still lived. Corporate drills were scheduled at sunrise, armed with permits, models, and confidence. But stone doesn't care about paperwork, and pressure doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. One Navy SEAL chose to listen to his dog instead of his pride, and a valley was saved. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to The Last Command K9. Northern Light has a way of lying to you. It makes everything look honest. The sky that morning was a flawless sheet of pale blue, stretched wide and cold above the ridgeline. Sunlight spilled over the pine forest and caught the river below in ribbons of silver. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but clean, almost surgical. Graham Wilder preferred mornings like that. Clean, precise, predictable. He drove his truck slowly up the narrow mountain road, hands steady on the wheel. 28 years old, 6'1", shoulders broad beneath the fitted digital camouflage long sleeve he wore even off-duty. The fabric sat close to his torso, not loose, not decorative, functional. His matching camo trousers were pressed and structured at the knees and thighs, boots tan and high-cut, made for uneven terrain. A dark tactical belt circled his waist, holding a pouch and a holster-shaped equipment sheath, tools, not weapons. A steel watch with a black face rested against his wrist, its weight a quiet reminder of measured time. He wasn't discharged. He was on medical hold. Temporary. That word tasted metallic. There was a faint scar at the top of his right shoulder, pale against his slightly sun-touched skin. It tightened when the weather dropped. It was tightening now. The military psychologists had told him to reduce stimulation, avoid confrontation, avoid high-risk terrain. He had nodded, and then he'd driven into the mountains. On the passenger seat sat Coda. The German shepherd was not large in the exaggerated way of show dogs, but balanced. Compact muscle layered under short, dense black and tan fur. His ears were upright and still. His amber-brown eyes, deep, steady, tracked the environment without turning his head much. He did not pant. He did not whine. He listened. Coda had the posture of a professional. Weight evenly distributed, breath controlled. His temperament was disciplined, observant, responsive. When something unsettled him, he did not bark first. He froze. Graham pulled into a gravel overlook and killed the engine. Silence expanded. The valley below looked painted. Pine forest, silver river, snow clinging to shadowed creases of rock. It was so beautiful it felt staged. "This is what quiet looks like," Graham muttered. He stepped out, boots crunching lightly. The cold bit through fabric but felt welcome. Pain was grounding. Coda exited without command and moved to Graham's side, not ahead, not behind, exactly aligned with his thigh. A soldier's dog. Graham adjusted the strap on his belt and began hiking down the marked trail. He respected boundaries, even now. The trail curved along a slope where a small rock slide had recently exposed fresh stone. Gray shards scattered across the path. Halfway through the unstable section, Coda stopped. Not gradually, instantly, his body locked. Head slightly tilted, eyes angled upslope. No growl, no bark, just a full, rigid stillness that seemed to push against the air itself. Graham nearly took another step before realizing the leash line had gone taut. He looked down at the dog. "Coda." No response. The German shepherd stood as if anchored, muscles coiled but unmoving, ears forward, eyes sharp. Graham followed the dog's line of sight. At first he saw only rock and shadow. Then the angle shifted and something geometric cut against the organic lines of the mountain. Wood. A structure. An old cabin clung to the cliff face about 40 yards above, partially concealed by pines. Moss covered the roof. Weathered timber walls leaned outward slightly, but not from rot, from design. Stone pillars had been stacked beneath the overhang. Steel braces anchored the structure into bedrock. It did not look abandoned by nature, it looked engineered to resist nature. Below it was nothing but drop, a sheer fall into the ravine. Sunlight struck the cabin at an angle that made it almost warm, almost inviting. It should not have been there. Graham felt the familiar tightening at the back of his neck. Not fear. Assessment. Wind direction. Soil stability. Load distribution. Coda remained frozen, and that stillness pulled something loose inside Graham. Another morning. Another dog. Juno had stood like that once, years ago. Overseas. In a concrete compound that looked empty, Juno had blocked a doorway. Graham had stepped around her. The building had collapsed 30 seconds later. No one blamed him. The after-action report had called it unpredictable structural fatigue. Juno had been lost in operational conditions. Lost. The word had never fit. Coda shifted slightly, still blocking the path. Graham's jaw tightened. His blue-gray eyes darkened with the weight of memory. He could step around again. He didn't. He took half a step back instead. The movement felt small. It felt enormous. "Okay," he said quietly. The wind passed over them, carrying the scent of cold pine and something else. Faint, metallic. Coda's nose twitched. Graham looked back at the cabin. It was beautiful in a way that felt wrong. The moss gave it softness. The bracing gave it tension. It seemed less like a home and more like a held breath. He checked his watch unconsciously. 9:42. Sun high enough to illuminate angles. He scanned for smoke, tracks, recent disturbance. Nothing obvious. And yet, Coda took one step sideways, not forward, not retreating, positioning. Graham crouched beside him. "What are you hearing?" The dog's eyes flicked to Graham briefly, then returned upslope. Infrasound? Subsurface cavity? Wind resonance? Or just instinct? The mountain was silent. Too silent. A glint of light flickered briefly near the cabin's roofline. Not sunlight on glass, there were no visible windows at that angle. Metal, small, sharp, gone. Graham straightened slowly. Coda's posture shifted from frozen to alert ready, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of shift that meant not danger immediate, but presence confirmed. Someone else might be up there, or something that had been disturbed recently. Graham felt the old surge begin, the edge that had defined him in combat, the part of him that assessed threat vectors before a thought could interfere. He was supposed to avoid this, avoid confrontation, avoid high-risk terrain. But the cabin did not feel like a risk he could walk past. It felt like an unfinished sentence. The wind changed direction, carrying a slightly stronger trace of oxidized metal. Not rust from exposed nails, something deeper, structural. Coda finally relaxed enough to take a slow step forward. Not downhill. Upslope. He did not pull. He waited. For Graham stood still for a long moment. The sun warmed one side of his face, highlighting the angular cut of his jaw, the faint shadow where stubble would have been if he ever let it grow. His expression remained neutral. But inside something was moving, slow, deliberate. Was he chasing danger? Or was danger calling him back? He exhaled through his nose. "Not today," he murmured. But he didn't turn around. Instead, he studied the slope more carefully. The soil near the base of the rock slide looked recently disturbed, not by animals, by weight. Boot tread? Hard to tell from this distance. Coda stepped again, this time slightly ahead, but angled across Graham's path, not blocking now, guiding. The difference was subtle. Juno had blocked. Coda was guiding. Graham adjusted his footing and shifted his weight upward onto a stable rock. He didn't climb yet. He assessed. Load paths beneath the cabin, brace angles, anchor points. The structure had been designed by someone who understood stress distribution. The stone pillars weren't decorative. They were compensating. For what? He looked at the river below. The valley. The thin road cutting through trees in the distance. If that cabin were tied into the rock face in a specific way, if the rock face were unstable. His mind began mapping possible fault lines. Coda suddenly lifted his head higher and inhaled sharply. Not alarmed? Focused. Then he did something subtle but decisive. He stepped back in front of Graham again. Not aggressive, firm, and he sat. Directly in the path. Graham stared at him. "You're serious?" Coda did not move. The dog's eyes held steady, unblinking. It was not fear in them, it was certainty. Graham felt the echo of Juno's last look. The psychologists had said survivor's guilt manifests as overcorrection. Maybe this was that. Maybe he was reading meaning where there was none. But his body knew this sensation. The pause before something irreversible. He looked back at the cabin. It stood there, quiet, as if aware of being observed. The sunlight softened its edges, making it almost pastoral, but the braces under it caught light again. Steel, industrial, engineered, not built for comfort, built for endurance. Graham made a decision. He stepped back from the unstable section of trail entirely. "Okay," repeated softly. Coda relaxed fractionally. The dog stood, tail low but not tucked, posture easing. They would not approach today. Graham turned slowly, scanning once more before retreating down the marked path. As they walked, he did not feel like he was avoiding something. He felt like he had been warned. And this time, he had listened. Behind them, high on the cliff face, the cabin remained suspended between sky and stone, untouched by their absence. But the mountain did not feel empty anymore. It felt awake. Graham did not return to the trailhead. Instead, he circled wide along the lower ridge, choosing a vantage point with a clear line of sight toward the cliff without placing himself directly beneath it. Years of training had conditioned him to think in arcs and angles, never straight lines. He removed a compact pair of binoculars from his pouch and steadied his elbows against a boulder. Through the glass, the cabin sharpened. No decorative trim, no smoke stains, no seasonal damage typical of vacation structures. The roof's moss growth was thick but uniform, suggesting long-term exposure, not recent neglect. The stone pillars beneath it were not random stacks. They followed deliberate spacing, compensating for weight distribution. It wasn't clinging to the mountain, it was anchored into it. Graham scanned for a main path. There wasn't one. No obvious trail leading to the door, no trampled approach. But near the back slope, partially obscured by brush, he noticed something. Faint, a worn strip in the vegetation, subtle, old. The kind of route used deliberately and then abandoned. A secondary access. His jaw tightened. Coda stood beside him, body angled slightly downhill, nose working constantly. The dog's gait had shifted since they moved closer. Shorter steps, slower pace, more deliberate breathing. Graham crouched and brushed his hand over the ground. The soil carried multiple scents layered over time. Old mineral deposits, pine sap, cold rock, and underneath it, metal. Not rusted iron from scattered debris, something structural. Then another note reached him faintly, one he would not have detected without the dog. Human, fresh, not days old, hours. Coda lifted his head sharply, eyes narrowing toward the cabin again. The sky above remained flawless, almost cruelly beautiful. And yet the wildlife pattern felt wrong. Graham noticed the absence only after standing still long enough. No bird chatter, no squirrel movement along the branches near the men. Structure. Animals were not gone. They were avoiding. He lowered the binoculars slowly. "Someone's been there," he murmured. Coda did not break posture. Graham studied the slope again, calculating distance and potential approach routes. He could climb. But climbing meant exposure, and exposure meant committing. Instead, he backed away carefully and moved further downhill, selecting a campsite in a naturally sheltered hollow with firm ground and a clear exit path. He did not build a fire. Not because of temperature, because of visibility. The night came gently, without drama. Stars spread across the sky in impossible density. The river below turned black except for thin streaks of reflected starlight. Graham lay back against his pack, boots still on, watch face catching the faint glow of the moon. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep. Medical hold meant evaluation, therapy, conversations about reintegration. It did not erase instinct. Beside him, Coda moved, not restlessly, purposefully. The German shepherd circled the perimeter twice, nose skimming the ground, then paused facing upslope. His muscles tightened slightly. Graham felt it before he heard it. A low vibration, not audible, but tactile. The rock beneath his palm carried a faint tremor. Not enough to register as an earthquake, more like a breath held too long and released. Coda emitted a single, low sound. Not a bark, a restrained warning. Graham pushed himself upright slowly. He pressed his palm to the earth. The vibration faded. "Infrasound," he whispered. Subsurface cavity resonance. Hollow spaces within the rock could amplify minor environmental shifts. Wind pressure, temperature drop. Nothing supernatural, nothing mystical. But the dog's reaction wasn't generalized alert. It was specific. This was the posture K9 units used when trained for structural instability during collapse rescue drills. Coda was not afraid. He was evaluating. Graham felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He had once mistaken silence for safety. He would not make that mistake again. Around midnight, wind shifted from the east. The temperature dropped sharply. Coda froze again. But this time not toward the cabin, toward the lower tree line. Graham turned his head slightly, careful not to make sudden movements. Footsteps. Measured. Light but confident. Not animal. Human. A beam of red-filtered light swept briefly across the trunks below, then disappeared. Graham's pulse slowed instead of rising. Red filter meant preservation of night vision. Professional. He did not reach for any weapon. He waited. The steps approached cautiously, then stopped at the edge of the hollow. A man stepped into partial moonlight. He was in his early 50s, tall but slightly stooped, with wind-chapped skin and iron-gray stubble lining his jaw. His hair, once dark, had thinned unevenly at the temples. He wore a heavy flannel under a faded canvas jacket and carried himself like someone accustomed to field work rather than combat. He kept his hands visible. "Evening," the man said quietly. His voice was steady but not aggressive. Graham rose slowly to his feet, keeping his stance neutral. Coda did not bark. He stepped between the man and Graham, not threatening, just precise. The man noticed the dog's posture immediately. "Good dog," he said softly. "Trained." His eyes moved to Graham's uniform. "You're military." "Still," Graham replied. The man nodded once. "Caleb Horn." He extended no hand. Caleb's gaze flicked briefly toward the cliff above. "You've seen it." Not a question. Graham studied him. Caleb had the posture of someone who had spent decades outdoors. Shoulders slightly rolled forward, weight balanced over worn boots. His fingers were rough, nails short, knuckles scarred from labor. He was not nervous, but he was tired. "You know about it," Graham said evenly. Caleb exhaled through his nose. "I used to." He crouched slowly, keeping on his distance from Coda. "I was a geological consultant 30 years ago. Contract work. We were brought in after the government pulled out." Pulled out. The phrasing carried history. Caleb's eyes held a kind of restrained frustration, not fear, not guilt. Something like unfinished responsibility. "They built it to measure stress," he continued. "Seismic monitoring, Cold War paranoia." Graham's expression did not change. "And now?" Caleb looked back toward the mountain. "Now someone thinks it's stable enough to drill again." The wind passed between them, carrying the scent of stone. Graham felt something settle into place internally. "Who?" "Private firm," Caleb answered. "Northern Geologic Consulting." The name meant nothing yet. "They've been doing quiet survey passes, 6-month intervals, no publicity." "Why tell me?" Caleb's eyes shifted to Coda. "Because that dog reacted the same way the one back then did." Graham's breathing paused. Caleb continued carefully. "There was a dog assigned to the site. Structural detection training. It wouldn't go near the lower shaft after a while." Lower shaft. Graham did not show recognition. "They ignored it," Caleb said. "Funding pressure." His voice hardened slightly. "And we logged anomalies, increasing stress pockets." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Then they shut it down, officially." Officially, meaning something remained. Coda shifted his weight subtly. Caleb noticed. He stood slowly. "They're scheduled to return in a few days," he said. "Return to do what?" "Test vibration. See if the rock's settled enough." Graham felt the cold bite deeper into his skin. Testing vibration in a stressed formation could trigger slippage. If the slope failed. The valley below flashed in his mind. The river, the road. Caleb took a step back. "I didn't come here to scare you," he said. "But if you're looking up there, you deserve to know it's not abandoned." He paused. "And if that dog doesn't like it?" He glanced at Coda again. "I'd listen." As Caleb turned to leave, Coda did something unexpected. Instead of watching the man depart, the dog pivoted sharply and stared directly at Graham. Not at the mountain, not at the trail, at him. The gaze held longer than instinct required. It was not warning. It was recognition, a silent question. Graham felt a subtle jolt beneath his feet again, barely perceptible, like distant thunder under stone. The dog's eyes did not waver. For a split second, Graham had the irrational sensation that this moment had happened before. Not memory, pattern. He exhaled slowly. "I know," he whispered. The vibration ceased. Caleb's footsteps faded into the trees. The forest resumed its quiet. But something fundamental had shifted. Dawn came with frost lining the hollow. Graham packed deliberately, movements precise and economical. He checked the slope once more through binoculars. Stillness. Too much stillness. He replayed Caleb's words. 6-month intervals. Private firm. Test vibration. If the formation had accumulated internal stress over decades, controlled vibration might not be controlled at all. He imagined the cascade. A rock face slipping. Pillars shifting. The cabin acting like a lever. And beneath it all, a potential chain reaction. Kota moved to his side, posture calm now, but alert. He was not agitated. He was resolved. Graham felt the internal debate settle. Medical hold. Avoid confrontation. Avoid high-risk terrain. He looked down at the valley one last time, then up at the cabin. It no longer looked picturesque. It looked like a pressure gauge disguised as architecture. He clipped the leash securely. "We're not done," he said quietly. He did not move toward the cliff, not yet. He turned instead toward the road that led down into town. Information first, action later. As they descended the trail, the morning light strengthened, warming the forest floor. Behind them, high against the cliff face, the cabin remained suspended, silent, engineered, waiting. And somewhere within the mountain, stress gathered in ways no one could see, but someone would try to measure it. Soon, morning arrived clean and unforgiving. Sunlight poured over the cliff face, turning frost into steam and painting the moss-covered cabin in gold. From a distance it looked serene, almost pastoral. A forgotten artist's retreat suspended between sky and stone. Graham Wilder knew better. He stood at the base of the slope, shoulders squared beneath his fitted digital camouflage long sleeve, boots planted carefully on stable rock. The tan leather creased, but held firm. His steel watch caught the sun briefly before he angled his wrist away. He had told himself the night before that information would come first. He had also not slept. Kota stood beside him, silent. The German shepherd's black and tan coat shone sharply in the light, muscles compact and ready beneath short, dense fur. His ears were upright, his tail low but steady. There was no agitation in him, only calculation. Graham exhaled once and began the ascent. He moved slowly, deliberately, testing each foothold before shifting weight. His right shoulder tightened faintly in the cold, a dull reminder of scar tissue beneath skin. The climb was not long, but the terrain demanded respect. Near the base of the cabin, he paused. Up close, the structure revealed its true character. The stone pillars were not decorative stacks. They were braced at angles that redistributed load away from the cliff's weak seams. Steel anchors disappeared into drilled sockets in the rock, sealed with a compound that had aged but not cracked. He crouched and brushed his fingers along one anchor plate. Machined. Industrial. Not homemade. Near the back edge, faint impressions in the soil caught his eye. The ground was compacted unnaturally, flattened repeatedly over time. No fresh footprints were visible, but the pattern told a story of movement, measured, repetitive. Kota advanced a few steps ahead, nostrils flaring slightly, metal, oil, cold mineral, and something else that had not yet faded, human. Graham's jaw tightened. The cabin door stood before them. Thick timber reinforced with metal hinges, no visible decay at the joints, no splintering along the frame. Even the handle showed minimal corrosion. He reached out slowly. Kota shifted to the side, not blocking this time, but aligning himself slightly off-center, posture taut like a drawn line. Graham wrapped his fingers around the handle. It turned without resistance. The door opened smoothly, too smoothly. There was no groan of neglected wood, no scrape of misaligned hinges. It swung inward on balanced weight, controlled, like it had been designed never to fail. Graham stepped inside. The air was cool but dry, not the stale dampness of abandonment, not the must of rotting wood. It smelled faintly of old paper, metal, and dust undisturbed for long stretches, yet not chaotic. The interior was not a living space. There was no bed, no stove, no signs of domestic life. Instead, a heavy central table bolted to the floor, metal chairs secured at their bases, shelving units along the walls, mostly empty but marked with fading alphanumeric codes. On the beams above, carved notches and stamped numbers indicated load tolerance measurements. This had been a workspace, a station. Coda moved methodically across the room, not curious, systematic. His head dipped toward the floorboards near the cliff-facing wall. His breathing slowed. Then he pawed lightly at one plank, not scratching, pointing. Graham did not rush. He stood still for several seconds, scanning the ceiling and walls, tracing anchor paths with his eyes. The braces ran deeper than surface level. Reinforcement extended below. He remembered Juno in a collapsed building, remembered dismissing the hesitation as overtraining. He would not override again. Coda tapped the plank once more, softer this time. Graham knelt. He ran his hand across the boards. The wood was thick, but beneath the grain, he felt resistance. Metal framework hidden under the surface. He removed a compact pry tool from his pouch. Slow, controlled. The first plank lifted with a muted creak. Cold air exhaled from below. Not wind. Contained air. Dense and mineral heavy. Graham leaned slightly forward. Beneath the wooden flooring lay a steel lattice, supporting something voided beneath. He removed another board. A square of reinforced steel framed a vertical opening. Concrete. Descending into shadow. A shaft. Coda immediately moved in front of it. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stood directly between Graham and the opening, muscles coiled, breathing steady but deeper. Graham stared at him. "You think it's unstable?" The dog's gaze flicked briefly to the darkness below, then back at Graham. The air rising from the shaft felt colder than ambient temperature. He switched on a compact flashlight and angled the beam downward. Concrete walls extended several meters before turning into shadow. There were narrow steps bolted along one side, old, but intact. As the flashlight beam traced the inner wall, it caught something unexpected. Not debris, not rubble. A thin, almost invisible line running along the concrete, like a hairline fracture. But it wasn't random. It followed a subtle curve, branching slightly, like the outline of pressure spreading outward from a central point. At the exact moment Graham registered it, Coda's body tightened sharply. Not in panic. In recognition. The dog leaned forward slightly, then stopped himself. Graham felt the faintest tremor pass through the floorboards beneath his knee. Not strong enough to destabilize him, but enough. The flashlight beam flickered as his hand steadied. He didn't move. He listened. Silence. Absolute. Then, a distant, almost imperceptible shifting sound deep within the mountain. Not collapse. Adjustment. Coda turned his head slightly, ears angled, calculating direction. Graham realized something chilling in its simplicity. This shaft was not dormant. It was responsive, and something, whether temperature change, wind pressure, or geological settling, was interacting with it in real time. Coda stepped back deliberately. then forward again, not blocking completely now, allowing proximity, but demanding caution. Graham understood. He holstered the flashlight momentarily and studied the opening again. Concrete walls meant engineered containment. This wasn't a natural cave. It had been constructed, carefully. He lowered himself onto one knee beside Coda and placed a steady hand on the dog's neck. The fur was warm despite the cold air. "You're not afraid," he murmured. The dog's breathing slowed. Neither was he. But fear wasn't the metric. Risk was. Graham rose slowly and scanned the room once more before returning to the opening. He retrieved a compact measuring device from his pouch, a small vibration reader he occasionally used for terrain analysis during training drills. He placed it gently on the steel lattice beside the shaft. The digital display flickered. Minimal reading, then a small spike, then flat again, intermittent, not random, patterned. He exhaled carefully. The fracture line inside the shaft likely corresponded to stress distribution within the rock face. If external vibration was introduced, his mind finished the equation without words. Coda shifted again, stepping directly in front of the opening once more. This time not as a barrier, as a statement. Not yet. Graham nodded slowly. Not yet. He replaced the planks carefully, one by one, restoring the surface exactly as he found it. He did not want to alter load distribution unnecessarily. Once finished, he stepped back and surveyed the interior again. The heavy bolted table, the absence of personal effects, the reinforced beams. This place had been built to monitor something dangerous, not to live in. He approached the far wall where faint residue outlined where equipment once hung. The rectangular marks suggested panel mounts, likely seismic instrumentation. His pulse steadied. If the private firm intended to conduct vibration testing here, they might be unknowingly, or knowingly, interacting with residual stress pockets within the rock. He glanced toward the door. Sunlight streamed across the floorboards, harmless and warm. Outside, the valley gleamed as though untouched by consequence. Graham walked to the threshold and stepped onto the narrow porch-like extension facing the drop. The river below shimmered. A thin road cut across the forest in the distance. He imagined rock cascading down the slope, gathering speed, striking lower outcrops, amplifying force. Chain reaction. He felt a cold certainty settle inside him. The mountain wasn't stable. It was contained. And containment always had limits. Coda joined him at the edge, posture calm but alert, scanning the horizon. Graham rested his gloved hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. "You were right to wait." The wind rose gently, brushing against the moss-covered roof. For a brief moment, the cabin creaked. Not in decay, but in adjustment, wood responding to temperature shift. Graham turned back inside one final time, memorizing structural details. Then he closed the door carefully. It shut with quiet precision. No resistance, no noise. He stepped down from the base and began descending the slope. He did not hurry. He did not look back immediately. Only when he reached stable ground did he turn once more. The cabin stood unchanged in golden light. From a distance, it looked harmless, almost romantic. But now he knew. It was not a relic. It was a gauge. And something inside the mountain was still measuring. Graham adjusted his belt slightly, feeling the weight of tools at his hip. "We need data," he said quietly. Coda looked up at him, steady and unwavering. They descended toward the valley road. The sun rose higher. The day remained clear. But beneath the cliff face, unseen and patient, pressure gathered in silence. Graham did not descend immediately. He waited. Coda's breathing shifted first, slow, controlled, steady. The German Shepherd stepped half a pace aside from the shaft opening, no longer blocking completely. Not inviting, but allowing. Permission. Graham clipped a compact headlamp over his ear and lowered himself carefully onto the bolted metal steps. Each footfall was deliberate. His tan boots made almost no sound against the steel. The temperature dropped sharply after the first 3 steps. Cold, dense air pressed against his face. Concrete walls surrounded him, smooth, poured with precision, not natural stone. The shaft narrowed slightly before opening into a small, subterranean chamber. He stepped off the ladder and swept the light across the room. It was dry. Unnaturally dry. No mold, no dripping moisture. The air smelled mineral and metallic, but controlled. Along one wall stood metal shelving units holding weathered binders and rolled maps secured with string. On the far side, a fixed steel desk anchored to the floor. A vibration chart panel, its analog dials frozen at 0. This wasn't a shelter. It was an observation room. Graham removed his gloves and lifted the first binder. Inside were geological cross-sections, hand-drawn but precise. Fault lines marked in red pencil, shaded areas indicating stress accumulation, stamped in faded ink, Aurora Ridge, 1953 to 1959. Minimal classification code. He moved to the steel desk. A leather-bound notebook lay there, cracked with age but intact. He opened it carefully. Technical entries filled the pages. Stress readings, inconsistent with surface stability reports. Subsurface cavity amplification confirmed. Pressure pockets deepening along secondary seam. The handwriting changed slightly midway through the log. Sharper strokes, more urgent. Recommendation to halt vibration tests until long-term displacement modeling complete. The next entry, order received to continue testing for data acquisition. Graham's jaw hardened. Not conspiracy. Compromise. Funding versus caution. He turned another page. Dog refused entry to lower shaft today. Repeated stance. Untrained reaction. Observation. Animal responds to stress variation before instrumentation. Graham froze. He looked up instinctively. Coda remained at the top of the steps, visible as a silhouette against faint light from above. The dog's outline was still, composed. Graham returned to the journal. Final entry, dated 1959. Project suspended. Decommission incomplete. Structural integrity unpredictable. Recommendation: preserve site to avoid destabilization. Below it, in different ink, demolition rejected. Risk of cascade failure too high. Graham closed the notebook slowly. Not abandoned. Contained. He scanned the shelves again and noticed something tucked between the binders. A sepia-toned photograph. He lifted it carefully. 5 men stood in front of the cabin decades earlier, hard. Hats. Wool coats. Clipboards. Beside them sat a German Shepherd. The dog's posture was unmistakable. Standing rigid. Positioned slightly ahead of the group. Guarding. Under the photograph, handwritten in narrow script, the dog knew first. Graham felt something tighten behind his sternum. He remembered Juno, her last stance, her refusal to move. The memory was not loud. It was precise. Coda shifted above him, claws scraping faintly against wood. Graham tucked the photograph into the notebook and placed both back exactly where he found them. He wasn't there to disturb history. He was there to understand it. As he turned to ascend the steps, Coda did something unusual. The dog did not hold position at the top. He descended halfway down the ladder toward Graham. Not blocking, not retreating, meeting him. Their eyes locked in the narrow shaft. And in that confined space, Graham felt something that had nothing to do with geology. Not destiny, not mysticism, recognition, the past, had repeated a pattern once before. And this time, he was not alone in seeing it. Coda's tail flicked once, slow and controlled. Then the dog stepped back up, reclaiming the threshold. Graham climbed after him. The moment passed, but it left weight behind. Back inside the cabin, Graham replaced the floorboards precisely, ensuring even alignment. He checked each seam for pressure variation before standing. The room felt smaller now, not because of confinement, because of context. He moved to the door and paused. There it was again, a faint sound, not structural. Footsteps, measured, light. Graham switched off his headlamp instantly. Coda pivoted toward the door, posture transforming in less than a second from neutral to defensive ready. Not aggressive, strategic. The steps halted outside the cabin. A pause. Then a man's voice. Calm, low, controlled. "I don't want to startle you." Graham did not respond immediately. He stepped to the side of the doorframe, maintaining angle. Coverage. Coda positioned slightly ahead, but not visible from outside. "You shouldn't be here," the voice added. Not hostile, certain. Graham opened the door slowly. Caleb Horn stood just beyond the threshold. In daylight, the older man looked even more weathered. Mid-50s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of leaning over rock samples had curved his spine subtly. His face was cut by deep lines at the corners of his mouth. His hair, thinning and iron gray, was combed back without vanity. Stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore a heavy canvas field jacket, faded olive, and carried a leather satchel slung across one shoulder. His hands remained visible. He did not step inside. Coda stood in the doorway. Caleb's gaze flicked to the dog first. He nodded slightly. "Still listening?" he said quietly. Graham studied him. "You followed me." Caleb gave a thin, almost apologetic smile. "I monitor the slope periodically. Old habits?" He glanced at the doorframe. "You went below." Not a question. Graham's expression did not shift. Caleb exhaled. "Then you saw enough." He stepped half a pace back from the doorway, deliberately respecting the invisible line Coda maintained. "I was a geological consultant on the secondary review panel in '89, Caleb continued. "After the government suspended it." His voice carried fatigue, not fear. The fatigue of someone who had argued and lost before. They were supposed to seal it permanently. But sealing requires drilling anchor bolts deeper. And drilling risks destabilization, Graham said flatly. Caleb nodded once. Exactly. The wind shifted, carrying pine resin and distant water. "They've scheduled another vibration test," Caleb added. "Private contract. Northern Geologic Consulting." Graham's eyes sharpened slightly. "When?" "Soon." Caleb hesitated, then added, "They believe modern modeling can compensate for the pressure pockets." "And you don't." Caleb looked past Graham into the cabin interior. "I've seen what modeling misses." He tapped the leather satchel lightly. "Paper can look stable. Rock doesn't care about paper." Coda remained motionless, gaze fixed on Caleb's chest, not threatening, simply assessing. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly in acknowledgement of the dog's presence. "You military?" he asked quietly. "Still," Graham replied. Caleb studied him for a moment longer. "There's a town below," he said. "River Road runs directly through the base of the slope." Graham had already calculated that. "If the formation fails," Caleb continued, "it won't be gradual." He did not dramatize it. He didn't need to. Graham stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. He stood at equal height with Caleb now. What aren't you telling me? Graham asked calmly. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. They never finished mapping the secondary seam. He looked toward the cliff. Stress doesn't disappear. It redistributes. Silence stretched between them. Graham could see the weight in Caleb's posture, not guilt, but responsibility deferred. Coda stepped forward once, sniffed the air between the two men, then returned to Graham's side. Caleb nodded faintly. You're going to get involved, he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was observation. Graham did not answer. He turned his gaze down the valley. The road below gleamed faintly under sunlight. Caleb adjusted the strap of his satchel. If you decide to intervene, he said, do it with data. Then he stepped away from the porch. Emotion won't stop them. Graham watched him descend carefully along the side trail. Coda tracked him until he vanished among the pines. The cabin stood silent behind them. Graham remained still for several long seconds. He felt no adrenaline, no rush, only clarity. He walked back inside briefly and glanced around once more. Steel table, reinforced beams, sealed history. Not a crime scene, a warning. He shut the door firmly and descended the slope with measured steps. As they reached stable ground, he looked up once more. The cabin appeared unchanged, suspended against the bright sky. But now he knew what it represented. Not nostalgia, not secrecy, pressure. And pressure always found release. Graham adjusted the strap on his tactical belt and began walking toward the valley road. Information first, action second. This time, he would not step past the warning. The town looked untouched. Midday sunlight washed over storefront windows and brick facades, glinting off parked trucks and cafe signs. A woman pushed a stroller past the hardware store. Two teenagers laughed outside a diner, milkshakes sweating in their hands. Wind chimes rang faintly from a porch across the street. It was almost offensively peaceful. Graham slowed his truck at the intersection before the county administration building. He scanned the skyline automatically, roof lines, angles, potential obstructions, then pulled into a shaded parking spot. Coda remained seated in the passenger seat until Graham gave a quiet nod. The German Shepherd stepped down with controlled grace, black and tan coat sharp against the pavement. His posture was neutral, tail low but steady. His eyes scanned slowly, cataloging movement without tension. People noticed him. They always did. Graham entered the building alone, leaving Coda tethered just outside the glass doors, where he could see both, street and interior. Inside, fluorescent lighting hummed overhead. The county records office smelled faintly of paper and printer toner. Behind the central desk stood Mira Sloan. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with posture that suggested discipline rather than fragility. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a tight, low bun at the nape of her neck. A few loose strands escaped, framing sharp cheekbones and pale, clear skin that rarely saw sunlight beyond office windows. Her eyes were steel gray, observant, analytical. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, practical rather than fashionable. A thin scar ran faintly across the back of her left hand, a childhood injury from a farm accident, she would later mention in passing. It had taught her something about structural failure before she understood the word. Mira did not smile easily. She measured. "You're not here for zoning permits," she said without preamble. Graham placed a folded copy of the Aurora Ridge documents on the desk. "I'm here for archived land restrictions," he replied calmly. Her eyes flicked to the papers. She didn't touch them immediately. What kind of restriction? The kind labeled non-development with recurring survey exceptions. Now she looked directly at him. Those clauses don't repeat unless there's liability attached. Graham said nothing. Silence was often more effective than persuasion. Mira finally opened the file. She read quickly, efficiently, her eyes moving across stress maps and annotations without hesitation. Her fingers traced the stamped dates. This region, she said slowly, was designated geologically sensitive in 1960. She turned toward her computer terminal and began typing. If it was permanently decommissioned, she continued, then any modern survey would require updated clearance. She paused. Her brows knit slightly. That's odd. What is? The designation is still marked restricted from development. But there are renewal entries under emergency access. She clicked deeper into the records. They're cyclical. How often? Every 6 years? Graham absorbed that. Mira leaned back slightly, which suggests ongoing assessment, not abandonment. She opened another document. A corporate name appeared in repeated signatures. Northern Geologic Consulting. Below that, a consistent authorizing signature. Dane Mercer. Mira's expression hardened subtly. He's ambitious, she said quietly. You know him? By reputation. She turned slightly toward the window, gaze distant for a second. 3 years ago, he oversaw a hydro site stability review near Bracken Ridge. The preliminary report was overly optimistic. And there was a minor slide 6 months later. No casualties, she added quickly, but enough to stall his trajectory. Her voice carried no malice, just documentation. He needs a clean success, she concluded. Graham nodded once. Outside, Coda shifted. Through the glass, Graham saw the dog's ears rotate sharply toward the parking lot. A white utility truck had just pulled into the adjacent space. Northern Geologic Consulting logo faintly visible on the door. A young man stepped out. Early 20s, thin build, sandy hair cut unevenly as if by clippers at home. He wore a company jacket 2 sizes too large, sleeves covering half his hands. His movements were hesitant but purposeful. He paused when he saw Coda. The dog did not move. He simply stood. The young man, Eli Harper, stopped mid-step. His eyes lingered on the shepherd longer than necessary. There was something in that look. Not fear. Recognition. Coda rose slowly. No growl, no shift of teeth, just a quiet repositioning, weight balanced, eyes steady. Eli's shoulders tightened. He looked down abruptly, almost embarrassed, and hurried inside. Eli entered the lobby but did not approach the counter immediately. He stood near the brochure rack, pretending to read. Graham stepped slightly aside, observing without appearing to. Eli's gaze drifted once more toward the door, toward Coda. For a fraction of a second, Eli's expression changed. Guilt, quick and involuntary. Then it vanished. He approached the counter and addressed Mira with rehearsed politeness. We're scheduled for preliminary clearance confirmation, he said, voice steady but pitch slightly higher than natural. Mira met his gaze coolly. For Aurora Ridge? Yes, ma'am. Her fingers rested lightly on the keyboard. You're early? Preparation. She studied him for a beat too long. Coda shifted outside again, just once. Eli's jaw flexed subtly. The room felt thinner. Not dangerous, tense. Graham said nothing, but he saw it now. Eli knew more than his job description required, and Coda knew it too. Mira printed copies of public documentation only. Nothing classified, and slid them across the desk. You'll need updated structural assessment clearance before drilling, she said evenly. Eli nodded. Yes, ma'am. He left quickly. Too quickly. Mira watched the door close. Your dog unsettled him, she observed quietly. He notices what instruments miss, Graham replied. Mira turned her chair slightly toward him. If you're suggesting an injunction, she said carefully, you'll need procedural backing. I've contacted Deputy Nolan Pierce. She nodded. That helps. As if summoned by name, Nolan Pierce entered minutes later. Mid-30s, broad-shouldered, with sandy stubble lining a square jaw. His sheriff's uniform fit comfortably rather than tightly, suggesting someone who relied more on judgment than intimidation. A thin scar cut across his eyebrow, left over from a high school football collision that had ended his scholarship dreams and redirected him toward law enforcement. He greeted Mira, first respectful but familiar. Then he faced Graham. I got your message, Nolan said. Geological hazard? Unverified, Graham answered, but historically documented. Nolan exhaled. If there's credible risk and testing hasn't been reassessed under modern safety codes, I can file a temporary safety hold. He looked toward the window. But I'll need more than old reports. Give me until sunrise, Graham said quietly. Nolan studied him for a long moment. You're still active duty. Medical hold? Nolan nodded slowly. That means you're not looking for a fight. No. Good. He adjusted his belt slightly. Because this stays procedural. Graham met his gaze evenly. Procedural. Outside, Coda resumed a seated posture. Calm, watching night settle gently over the valley. Street lights flickered on. Graham sat at the small wooden desk in his motel room, laptop open, scanning digitized copies Mira had sent securely. Coda lay near the door, head resting on paws but eyes open. Around 11:47 p.m., Mira's phone buzzed. An encrypted email. She forwarded it instantly. Subject line, preliminary vibration test schedule. Confidential attachment, PDF. Timestamp, tomorrow, 5:30 a.m. Below the attachment, a single anonymous line. They plan to drill. Graham read the schedule carefully. Coordinates matched Aurora Ridge precisely. He closed the laptop slowly. He did not curse. He did not pace. He looked at Coda. The German Shepherd rose without being told. Their eyes met. No adrenaline, no dramatic declaration, just decision. Graham stood and clipped the leash to Coda's collar. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we listen first. Coda's tail moved once. Steady. Outside, the town slept peacefully beneath a sky scattered with cold stars. No one below the ridge suspected that before sunrise, steel would meet stone, and pressure would be tested. Dawn came flawless. The sky opened in pale blue above Aurora Ridge, streaked with thin bands of gold. Frost clung to the upper brush, catching light like glass. From the valley below, nothing hinted at danger. It was the kind of morning that made doubt feel irrational. Graham stood at the edge of the old access trail, boots planted firmly on compacted earth that hadn't seen consistent traffic in decades. His digital camouflage sleeves were rolled just enough to expose the steel watch on his wrist. The second hand moved steadily, indifferent to tension. Coda stood beside him, body aligned with the narrow approach path that curved toward the concealed cabin above. The German Shepherd's posture was quiet but absolute. Muscles tight beneath short black and tan fur. Ears upright, eyes tracking distant engine noise long before it reached human range. The vehicles arrived in a convoy of 3. White utility trucks bearing the Northern Geologic Consulting logo rolled carefully along the old rear approach route. Gravel shifted beneath their tires in small bursts of sound. Doors opened. Dane Mercer stepped out first. He was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with the polished posture of someone accustomed to briefing investors in conference rooms. His dark hair was trimmed neatly at the sides, flecked with early gray at the temples. Clean-shaven, square jaw, eyes sharp but not cruel, calculating rather than aggressive. He wore a fitted field jacket with subtle branding and carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who believed he operated on evidence, not ego. 2 technicians followed him. One was Eli Harper, pale in the morning light, jacket zipped too tightly against the chill. The other was a middle-aged woman with auburn hair pulled into a tight braid. Dr. Sandra Kim, Northern's structural systems analyst. Her features were fine, precise. Her glasses reflected the horizon like mirrored shields. She walked with measured steps, every movement economical. Dane approached first. "Mr. Wilder," he greeted, voice smooth but firm. "I'm glad you came in person." Graham didn't move. "I prefer clarity," he replied. Dane glanced briefly at Coda. Impressive animal. "He listens," Graham said simply. Dane nodded once, then gestured toward the ridge. "We're conducting a shallow vibration assessment. Controlled, non-invasive, modern instrumentation." Nolan Pierce arrived moments later in his county cruiser, stepping out with steady authority. His expression was neutral, but his stance positioned him squarely between corporate authority and public safety. "You've been notified of a temporary safety review request," Nolan said evenly. Dane's lips tightened slightly. "With respect, Deputy, I have state clearance, which does not override immediate hazard assessment authority at the county level," Nolan replied calmly. Mira Sloan appeared last, breath visible in the cool air, carrying a slim portfolio under her arm. She wore a charcoal coat over her Navy office attire, practical boots replacing heels. She handed Nolan a document. "Clause 17B, she said. "Ambiguity in geotechnical impact review. Pending clarification." Dane scanned it quickly. "Technical delay," he dismissed lightly. "Not prohibition." Graham stepped forward slightly. "The structure above the seam was preserved because demolition risked cascade failure," he said. Dane met his eyes. "That was 70 years ago." "Rock stress redistributes," Graham replied. Sandra Kim cleared her throat softly. "Our preliminary models account for subsurface pressure pockets," she said in a precise, measured tone. "The amplitude we're applying is below destabilization thresholds." "Thresholds derived from what?" Graham asked. Sandra hesitated for half a second. "Barely perceptible. Archived data and updated seismic modeling." Eli shifted behind her. Coda's gaze flicked toward the young technician again. The silence stretched thin. Dane exhaled lightly. "We're not drilling the main shaft," he said. "We're running a surface calibration. If readings exceed tolerance, we stop." Nolan considered. "I won't authorize drilling until state review confirms stability." Dane nodded once. "Then we calibrate outside the cabin perimeter." He turned toward his team. "Set up." As the equipment was unloaded, a compact vibration generator mounted on a reinforced tripod, Coda moved, not toward the machine, toward the narrow trail leading to the cabin. He stepped into the center of the path and stopped. No bark, no growl. He lowered his center of gravity, paws planted firmly. Dane watched with mild irritation. "He's territorial." "No," Graham said quietly. "He's specific." Eli's face had gone pale. Sandra adjusted the frequency dial on the generator. "Low amplitude," she called out. Dane nodded. "Proceed." The generator hummed softly at first, a mechanical vibration barely perceptible to human ears. Coda's ears angled sharply. His body stiffened further, but he did not retreat. The hum deepened slightly. A low resonance rolled through the ground. Not loud, but felt. Like distant thunder underground. Eli's handheld monitor beeped once. "Reading spike," he muttered. Sandra frowned. That's not expected at this range. The hum intensified for half a second. Then, a deep, subterranean rumble answered. Not from the machine, from the mountain. Loose gravel trembled at the ridge edge. A small cascade of pebbles slid down the slope. Everyone froze. Dane's confidence cracked. Just slightly. Sandra looked at her tablet, eyes wide behind lenses. "Feedback amplification," she whispered. Coda lunged sideways, not toward the generator, toward Eli. A sharp, decisive movement. He grabbed the sleeve of Eli's oversized jacket and yanked him backward with controlled force. In that same instant, a chunk of stone the size of a car tire sheared loose from the upper ridge and tumbled downward, striking the ground precisely where Eli had been standing seconds before. Dust exploded upward. Nolan pulled Mira backward. Graham moved without hesitation, guiding Sandra behind stable rock. The generator shut down abruptly. Silence followed. Not peaceful, heavy. Pebbles continued to fall for several seconds before stopping. No one spoke. Eli's breathing came in sharp bursts. He stared at the impact crater. "If we drilled," he said hoarsely, "the resonance curve would have cascaded." Sandra swallowed. She studied her tablet. "The subsurface cavity is amplifying vibration non-linearly," she admitted quietly. "The old stress pocket is still active." Dane stood motionless. His jaw clenched. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't evil. He was ambitious. And ambition had nearly cost him lives. He looked at Graham. For the first time, there was no dismissal in his eyes, only calculation rebalancing itself. Eli's voice trembled. "If we increase amplitude even by 10%, it'll trigger lateral slip." Sandra nodded faintly. "Chain reaction possible." Nolan stepped forward. "I'm issuing an immediate stop order pending state evaluation." Dane did not argue. He stared at the ridge where dust still drifted lazily in morning sunlight. The valley below remained unaware. He turned slowly toward his team. "Pack it up." The order came quietly. No bravado, no anger, just acknowledgement. As the technicians disassembled equipment, Dane approached Graham. "You understand," he said softly, "that this doesn't end here." Graham met his gaze evenly. "I understand pressure." Dane glanced toward Coda, who now stood calmly beside Eli, having released his grip. "You were right to listen," Dane admitted. Then he lowered his voice further. "My backers won't interpret today as caution. They'll see obstruction." Graham's expression didn't shift. Dane stepped back toward his truck. "You won today," he said quietly, "but they won't step aside easily." He climbed into the vehicle. Engines started. The convoy retreated down the trail. Dust settled. Silence reclaimed the ridge. Eli lingered briefly, eyes still shaken. He approached Graham hesitantly. "I didn't send the email," he said quickly, "but I saw the schedule." Graham studied him. "You knew something was off." Eli nodded once. "My uncle was on that hydro site slide Mercer mentioned. He never walked right again." That explained the guilt in his eyes. "You can choose what kind of engineer you become," Graham said calmly. Eli swallowed. Then followed the convoy. Nolan exhaled deeply. "That was close." Mira looked at the fractured rock face. "It wasn't luck." She turned toward Coda. The shepherd stood relaxed now, tension gone. "He heard it first," she said quietly. Graham rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck. "He always does." The sun rose higher. The valley below remained intact, but the message had been delivered. Stone had answered, and everyone present had heard it. The official report was filed before noon. Deputy Nolan Pierce stood in the shade of his cruiser, pen steady in his hand as he completed the final lines of an imminent hazard notice. The paper did not dramatize what had happened. It didn't need to. Unstable slope, amplified subsurface resonance, immediate suspension recommended. Nolan's handwriting was firm, deliberate. He had grown up in the valley below Aurora Ridge. His father had run the town's only auto repair shop for 30 years. Nolan understood infrastructure the way some men understood faith, quietly, practically. He folded the document and handed a copy to Mira Sloan. "This will escalate," he said. "It should," Mira replied. Her voice carried neither fear nor triumph, only process. Back at the county office, she scanned and transmitted the documentation to the State Geological Oversight Board. She attached archived project records, vibration logs from Northern's aborted test, and Nolan's signed notice. Then she added one final line in her cover email, requesting immediate reclassification review under public safety statute. Across town, Eli Harper sat alone in his small apartment, laptop open on the kitchen table. He hadn't removed his jacket since returning from the ridge. Dust still clung faintly to the fabric. His hands hovered above the keyboard. He was 24 years old, a graduate in civil engineering who had believed data was neutral. That math corrected human error. His uncle's limp told him otherwise. Eli opened Northern's internal server access, credentials he technically still possessed, and downloaded everything he could before doubt reclaimed him. Email chains, amplitude override discussions, a draft commercial expansion plan titled Aurora Ridge Development Corridor, Phase 1 attached, were investor presentations. Clean renderings of eco-lodges perched near the valley's scenic overlook. Language about controlled natural integration. Buried inside one email thread was a line that made Eli's throat tighten. "If we wait for perfect modeling, funding evaporates." He closed his eyes briefly, then forwarded the entire archive to Jonah Keene. Jonah Keene did not work out of a polished newsroom. He wrote from a narrow brick building above a bookstore in the neighboring county. 62 years old, lean, silver hair combed straight back, wire-rimmed glasses resting low on his nose. His face bore the lines of someone who had listened to more lies than he'd told. He did not chase headlines. He stacked facts. When the files arrived, he didn't publish immediately. He called, he cross-checked, he verified timestamps and signatures. Then he wrote. Not a scandal piece, not an accusation, a layered record. Land designation history, project suspension notes from the 1950s, recent vibration testing attempt, corporate authorization signatures, commercial redevelopment drafts, and one question placed at the center of the article like a quiet wait. Who assumes responsibility if the ridge fails? By sunset, the piece circulated across regional feeds. By morning, state officials requested direct access to all related documents. Northern Geologic Consulting was placed under temporary operational suspension pending review. Aurora Ridge was reclassified within days. Cold War seismic observation site plus hazard preservation zone. Not demolished. Not exploited. Preserved and monitored transparently. 2 days after the article broke, Graham stood once more at the cabin porch. But he was not alone. Dane Mercer approached on foot this time. No convoy, no branding, just a man in a dark wool coat, hair slightly disheveled by wind. He stopped a few feet from the porch steps. Coda rose slowly from where he had been lying near Graham's boots. The German shepherd did not block the path. He watched. Dane's posture had changed. The confidence remained, but it had softened. "I'm under professional review," Dane said evenly. Graham did not respond. "I lost the contract," Dane continued. "Investors don't like uncertainty." Wind moved through the trees behind them. "I convinced myself," Dane admitted quietly. that risk could be converted into a number, something manageable. He looked at the cabin, then at the ridge. But stone doesn't negotiate. Coda stepped forward once, not aggressively, just closing the space. Dane held the dog's gaze. No resentment, only clarity. "You didn't try to humiliate me," Dane said to Graham. "You just refused to ignore what was in front of you." Graham's voice was steady. "You had the data. I chose the version that let me sleep." The admission hung between them. Not dramatic, human. Dane extended a hand. Graham looked at it for a second, then shook it once. No triumph, just acknowledgement. As Dane stepped back, he added quietly, "Your valley's intact because someone listened." He turned and walked away without looking back. Coda watched until he disappeared among the trees. Then he returned to Graham's side. The State Oversight Board moved quickly. Temporary measures became structural ones. Funding was redirected toward hazard mitigation rather than development. A public monitoring program was established. And then came an offer Graham hadn't expected. A modest contract, seasonal oversight, drainage inspection, vibration logging, perimeter access control, structural preservation of the historic site. It wasn't combat. It wasn't command. It was boundary work, the kind that required vigilance without violence. Graham considered it carefully. Medical hold had kept him suspended between identities, SEAL and civilian. This offered something different, continuity. He accepted weeks later. The cabin stood the same as it had that first morning. Moss along the roofline, steel anchors biting into stone, valley glowing below. But something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer a forgotten structure holding tension in silence. It was a known site, logged, understood, accountable. Graham installed updated seismic sensors inside the underground chamber, linking them to state oversight databases. He reinforced surface drainage channels to reduce water intrusion stress. He posted clear hazard signage along the trail without turning the place into spectacle. He moved with quiet precision. Coda followed him everywhere. The shepherd's posture had changed too. He still listened, still scanned. But the constant underlying tension that had once held him rigid was gone. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in an amber light, Graham sat on the porch steps. Coda lay beside him, not alert, not coiled, sleeping deeply. For the first time since the ridge had answered back, the dog's muscles fully relaxed. His breathing was slow and even. Graham rested a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder. The valley below shimmered gently under cooling sky. He spoke softly. Not to the mountain, not to the past. "Juno," he murmured, voice steady. This time I listened. There was no surge of emotion, no collapse, just alignment. The cabin creaked faintly in the evening breeze. Not from strain, but from temperature shift. It no longer felt like a structure holding its breath. It felt like something placed correctly within history. Later that evening, Graham descended into the underground room one final time before locking up for the night. He mounted a small brushed steel plaque beside the preserved documents. The letters were simple. Remembered, not buried. He stepped back and looked at it. Not as a memorial, as context. History wasn't erased. It was acknowledged. When he climbed back to the surface, dusk had settled fully. Stars appeared one by one over the ridge. Coda followed him out and paused briefly at the doorway before stepping into the open air. The valley lights flickered on below, quiet, intact, protected not by force, but by attention. Graham closed the cabin door gently, not sealing danger away, but keeping watch over what had already been learned. Sometimes the miracle isn't a mountain moving. Sometimes the miracle is that someone chooses to listen before it does. Aurora Ridge did not collapse because one man and one dog paid attention to a warning most people would have dismissed. It wasn't strength that saved the valley. It wasn't power. It was humility. The decision to pause, to hear, to trust what was quietly placed in front of them. In our lives, God rarely shouts. He whispers. He speaks through uneasy feelings, through small hesitations, through the voice that tells us to wait one more second, to look again, to choose integrity when shortcuts feel easier. Maybe the real miracle is not that danger was avoided, but that a heart once hardened by regret was given another chance to listen. If this story touched you, take it with you into your daily life. Listen more closely. Protect what matters. Stand where you are meant to stand. And when you feel that quiet warning in your spirit, don't ignore it. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that faith and responsibility walk hand in hand. Leave a comment about a moment when you felt guided to make the right choice. Subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this matter. May God bless you and your family. May He guard your home, steady your steps, and give you the wisdom to hear the warnings before the storm. And may the miracles in your life come not only as rescue, but as understanding.